But the big one is, of course, the release of Slipknot's 7th album, The End, so far, and we are going to tell you what we think of it right now. I had a realization a couple of weeks ago where I recognized how much Stone Sour have faded out of the world. And what I mean is, I came of age in the era when Slipknot felt like a kind of sleeping Goliath that would periodically emerge and do something that for that moment the world would not be able to move for. And then most of the time, it would go back to sleep, and the vast majority of that period, Corey Taylor would be on a magazine cover for something, new, not archived. It would be for Stone Sour, right? Between the years of 2009 and 2018, we got one Slipknot album. This is what I'm talking about. And I have yet to quite get my head around how those tables have been flipped in recent years, where between Slipknot's last album and this one, it doesn't really feel like they ever went away.
I mean, the closest we got was the Corey Taylor solo record basically being the Stone Sour alternative, wasn't it, really?
Sure, but I guess Slipknot, even with the fact that there was a pandemic, like when everyone went away for 18 months, but that kind of Slipknot sleeping titan gestation period that we grew so used to for most of the 2010s, they were still playing shows that felt at least like they were part of kind of the We Are Not Your Kind cycle when they put out the Chapeltown Brag and Corey swapped his mask. This is the first Slipknot album in like my musical lifetime that doesn't feel like they ever slowed down at all, really, before going from one into the next one, which is unique and novel, and maybe in conjunction with the state of things that we addressed quite extensively last week, is why it hasn't felt quite so much like a event this time.
I mean, that's it. There hasn't been the long period between it where people didn't get the chance to miss Slipknot, because again, like, everything kind of went away almost for a bit. Like, so
Slipknot did go away in 2020, like everyone, but you didn't notice Slipknot going away in any way out of the ordinary, because that's just what everyone did. Yeah,
exactly. So you didn't get the kind of like Slipknot coming back feeling like an event, like when they first dropped. When they dropped All Out Life that time, that felt like such a Slipknot are back. It's been ages. I don't think it had been as long as it had been, but it felt like it had been a long time. Whereas this time, it's kind of just been like, yeah, cool, Slipknot, they're still going, essentially.
Yeah, and there are some things of note around this album that mark it as significant. It is their first with Michael Fath as part of the band, although, again, it doesn't really feel like it because he was entirely on the cycle for We Are Not Your Kind. More dramatically, it's to be their last album with Roadrunner Records, with Corey in the press this week talking a fair bit of shit about their soon-to-be former label, so this is their parting shot. You have also had, interestingly, Jim Root saying, before the album's even out, that he doesn't think it's quite as good as it could be due to the lack of pre-production that was done before its recording due to the pandemic protocols, which, again, whether that shapes your feelings about the album or not, I think is interesting insight, even if you don't necessarily come out agreeing with him. That's in any way a problem. If you just consider that as a thing, it's like, oh, okay, this was an album that was kind of formed in the studio, is how he put it, rather than sort of heavily forged in advance. I say all this because although that's sort of the air going into it, and it's fascinating how it all, it colours it, because part of me is viewing this album almost as like an addendum to We Are Not Your Kind, or like a coda, as much as its own chapter, because there are kinships between the records that, along with how it's been rolled out, I think these eras of the band are going to be much easier to view as like fluid and symbiotic when charting the history of Slipknot than the jumps from basically any other one of their records into the next one.
Well, this I think has been quite deliberate by the band, because you hear this in the press, but we're getting off our label, that sort of thing. This, all in conjunction with each other, was some stuff that made me slightly apprehensive when this album was starting to come out, because it sounded a bit like, this isn't new Slipknot really, this isn't the new era, we're just sort of putting this to rest and then we're going to start the next thing. I mean, the fact that almost all of them kept their masks, and there wasn't a huge fanfare about that even, and when the album came out there was so much teasing, and that's, as you say, it didn't feel like this is the new era. It felt more like, oh, this is just the next album, which is a slight but meaningful difference.
Yeah, Elliot, you were saying when we were talking about having you on this review that you said it's the first time that for you, kind of in real time, they are following up an album that you really, really love. So how do you think that has coloured this?
Well, I sort of got into the band on All Hope Is Gone, but not because of All Hope Is Gone. Even at the time, I wasn't particularly hot on that album. I did feel like it was a step down from the first three, even then. And point 5 to me sort of confirmed that Slipknot weren't going to be a band I was going to be particularly creatively interested in moving forward. Slipknot weren't going to be a band that I was particularly interested in moving forward. Instead, they were going to be a bit of a heritage act. But We Are Not Your Kind, for me, and I think for a lot of people, was such a huge return to form that suddenly made me reconsider my feelings about the band on all levels. And so in that sense, it's the first time that I'm looking forward to a Slipknot album, not just because it's a new era and I know they'll be touring again, but also I want to hear new songs.
Yeah.
And so it's a level of expectation which I've not had with this band before, which feels crazy because they are a band that's been so important to me in my life. But this is the first time in over 10 years that I felt legitimately excited and trustworthy of a Slipknot.
I think a lot of people had that exact reaction with We Are Not Your Kind being a kind of like, oh, maybe they still do creatively have it. Because again, like, I really like every Slipknot album. But I'd kind of, like, when we discussed at length on the Grey chapter, it always felt like they were kind of like, I think people were ready for Slipknot to sort of settle down and just be reliable Slipknot at that point. But when they came out with We Are Not Your Kind, it felt like there was actually, like, excitement and experimentation and new ideas that made people kind of go, oh, they're not settling down, they're creatively still at it. And that was a great sort of feeling. And so, for me, that's actually carried over into, like, my excitement for this. I was kind of like, well, like, they showed they can still do it with We Are Not Your Kind. So even if I'm not, like, even if it's not felt like an event, the sort of Build the Salmon, I've been excited for it because I'm just like, I've got faith that if they show they can do it with We Are Not Your Kind, I had faith they can do it again.
Yeah, and I think this album might be an interesting, I guess, test of people's faith in that regard, because it's been interesting to get my head around because, you know, like we're saying, the nature of the album's creation and rollout and what we now have, it feels less like the grand Slipknot new era crowd pleaser, you know, the immediate fucking fireworks that you associate with seeing, hearing new Slipknot or whatever, and more the dark, experimental, slow burn that I think we've already begun to see a little bit is going to leave some less patient listeners cold.
Yeah, like, I think some people are going to hit play on this and are immediately going to be turned off. Like, I think, like, Adderall as an opener is going to be the sort of the litmus test as to can you hack where this album is going.
Even if it's not as, like, crowd pleasing and tour de force Slipknot, you know, they've come to fucking take on the world, which is what We Are Not Your Kind kind of felt like. This album, I think, furthers its grip into the seedier, eerier places of that album and extrapolates not the explosiveness, but more of the kind of creativity. And I think this album, while it might not be the crowd pleaser like that, is going to make this another very encouraging one for people wondering how Slipknot might be ages. Because as much as, like, I had some concerns as such when we had, like, the first bits of music from it, this is not a big band resting on their creative laurels. This album, I think, is so worthy of respect.
Well,
that is really how I feel, yeah.
Well, that thing you were saying about how when you started getting the taste of music, it didn't feel like it was, you know, lighting the world on fire. I think that was a very common thing. You could see it in, you know, the Spotify plays and the YouTube videos and stuff. It didn't. This is the first Slipknot album, maybe ever, that, spoiler alert, doesn't have a song on it, which feels like that's going to be in the set list forever. That's nailed on, whether you like it or not. Psychosocial, Duality, Devil in I.
Yeah.
You know, going back even further, yeah, even more. You know, and there was stuff on the last album like that, Unsainted and Nero Force. They were just songs that you felt, this is an all-time Slipknot greatest hit, you know, forever now.
I mean, there was a song that wasn't on the last album that was.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah. You've taken the words out of my mouth. I really agree.
Well, this is exactly it. It's the first time, and I think that will be a test for people as well. It's the first time they haven't got that total crowd-pleasing, you know, four on the floor, totally reliable banger, if you will.
See, maybe this is where my taste, but I kind of disagree. I think this album has got, like, crowd-pleasing bangers. I think when you live them from it, will become that, like, live staple, but they're not as I totally agree they're not as obvious, but I think they are there, absolutely, for my taste anyway. Like,
yeah, I think, you know, when we get into talking about all the individual tracks and stuff, the first two singles they released, I have really, really wormed their way into kind of my heart, and I do think, you know, when they play them live and everything, they will go off. But for a fact that you said, when you're talking about album tracks and stuff, you said you kind of have to live with it a little bit. And I guess that's sort of, you didn't have to live with Psychosocial. You didn't have to live with The Devil in I. And Adderall, I saw that they'd released this song like a few days ago. I really wish they hadn't. They got so close to the release of the album without spoiling
giving that curveball.
Yeah, and then the week of release they do it. Because pressing play on this album, as we did before that, seeing the next two songs on the album, like, are those singles that were more typical Slipknot songs, and being greeted with this first was such an insane thing to experience.
I'm so glad I'd not actually noticed they'd released it when I hit play on, or I didn't know that, and I hit play and I was just like, what? Like, again, because they've had like the kind of like intro-y track before, but this is
one of the longest songs on this whole album. This is a song.
A 5-minute, like, brooding, dark, like, eerie and like layered and textured with like choral vocals and everything all over it. So many ideas across this track. It's fucking wicked.
I mean,
like,
it starts. You're saying you're eerie and dark and stuff. It is, but not in a way that is obvious. Like,
it's kind of
like many other songs that they kind of have done in the past. It starts with this kind of like weird, like droning kind of organ like instrument. You don't know where the hell they are. Like, I love this. Like, it's the most distinct and like unforgettable thing on the album by miles. Like, you're never gonna misremember. Like, which one's Adderall again? That's gonna stand. And the fact that it starts the album as well is the best move, because it's so stirring and enticing and makes you want to know what the rest of this album is. It's because it's this kind of, you know, latter-day Radiohead-esque, slow burn electronica almost.
But it even changes. It throws you off straight away, and then after a minute it changes again. When that drone comes in, I thought, it's going to be like Prelude or XIX or something like that. And then when the beat comes in, and it's like a Dr. Dre G-Funk synth line of it. And I was just like, where are we now? And then it doesn't drop that, but that sort of goes away. And then it's like something from Black Star, you know, the David Bowie album.
Yeah.
It's just, and then the Beatles, a bit of like sort of Pink Floyd, their most sort of driving.
Taylor
it was just
choir like backing vocals of the ooh kind of. The song doesn't explode at any point into like, you know, now we're going to turn it into a metal song. It completely exists on its own terms as this kind of weird experimental track that is so sumptuous sounding and so bizarre and ethereal. There's even like a bit of like sort of high pitched female kind of chanting in the back of the mix.
Yeah,
that reminds me.
So much going on in it.
Yeah, and that reminds me of like Swans and even like latter day Nick Cave and stuff like that. And it gives this whole thing, even though it doesn't sound like a typical, we're going to do a spooky song like Slipknot have done a lot of times, and there are parts on this album, it's not one of those. But the weirdness in the atmosphere of it, even if it's not as like overwhelmingly murderous as you'd expect.
That's what I mean by it being dark, because it's unsettling because it's totally alien to what you're expecting from Slipknot.
And this is the thing I love about Slipknot when they do this. They have this touch of kind of the other and the strange.
Yeah.
And that's what marks out, you know, these kind of Slipknot songs from any other band. And exploring that newly in a new way with a song that's unlike anything they've ever done is like the most encouraging thing on this whole album in terms of like not getting lazy.
Well, that thing in
totally.
the question, that topic in the question earlier about what does Craig Jones do, the fact that so many people asked that thing about the atmosphere of the other, that is his contribution, and that is why he's a vital component. And the ear candy, already, I mean, it's a common theme throughout the album, as we'll get to, but the little like sparkles and trickles that just, you know, channel through your headphones, it just, as you say, it elevates it above what most other bands would do with this exact same song.
Yeah, and I do think as well, coming out of that space in track one, the very start of the Dying song, which when we did the single sound, we commented at sounding a little bit weird with kind of the vocal effects and stuff, it makes more sense coming out of Adderall and then kicking off like, okay, now here, track two is the direct Slipknot on the album. And like I said, these two songs now that are next, I really, really like. Now it's coming out of, again, track one. It's something so different just as a punch, and in the Dying song, that double-pronged chorus is fucking wicked. Like, the first part of that building into the second to keep building momentum is so good, and particularly the very last one when it lays the fuck into it and you have Corey screaming that melody line of "put your hands into like the water." Trick as old as time, sick every time it happens, but that like that part when it feels like it's being torn out of him is superb.
I think that's it. I think the Dying song having all of the classic Slipknot tricks in it, but coming off the back of Adderall, it kind of just makes them even more fun
More
in a way where you,
yeah.
Like, and that's the thing. I was like, I'm really in on the Dying song at this point. Like again, because I think I liked it more than you when it came out, but we had kind of agreements that it was like not like the best sort of thing. But like that hook has been stuck in my head. And like I said, yeah, just coming off the back of Adderall, it feels like such a great release.
Well, this song, I was listening to the podcast when this came out, and I thought everyone was going to be as excited as I was, because I thought the Chapeltown Rag, as we'll get to, when that first came out, it didn't really do that much for me. But I thought, nah, I'm in comfortable hands now, Slipknot have returned. And it didn't seem like people grew to it in that way. But I love it, as you say, even more in the context in this album, because
I really do love it now. It's still one of my favourites on the record, even.
Yeah, well, Adderall deliberately demands you to be a bit more patient. Again, Slipknot albums generally, they start with some sort of noisy looping thing and then explode. Adderall, with its repetition and those loops, just to go back to it for a moment, it sort of lulls you into a false sense of security. So then when it's actually, even for Slipknot, it's a short song, just over 3 minutes, for it to explode like that afterwards is such a rush, and it just shows real craft, and it shows a real understanding of dynamics, even within the first two songs. Yeah,
Chapeltown Rag is also, I think, of those two singles, it's the more obvious kind of shit-stirring one. And I think that song, the reason maybe when it came out, we were all kind of a bit like, okay, you've done this kind of thing before a lot of times.
The drum and bass beats and everything.
Yeah, and are you ever going to want it over, like, Eyeless or even All Out Life in a set list? Probably not, but it's thrilling, and Slipknot are the best because they are the only giant band that can do that with that blasting "we don't," like, it's just absolute fucking venom. And I think the chorus as well on that has some of that sort of chaotic pop that they were playing with on bits of We Are Not Your Kind, like Neo Forte and the like, that really both of those songs do work really, really well, just punching through there. The production on this album, I think, feels like, again, it's on sort of similar lines as We Are Not Your Kind, even though they'd gone from Greg Fiddleman from last time to Joe Barresi here, and you wouldn't really know it, which I think, along with Jim Root's comments about the production of this record, I think it makes me feel how much of Slipknot sound is kind of in-house, like them knowing how they want to sound, and it doesn't really matter who produces them, really. Like, they might get a different take out of them or whatever, but kind of the sound is Slipknot's. And like I said earlier when we were talking about the drummers, I think 2010s onwards now, Slipknot has this real kind of disciplined, mechanized kind of percussive feel, locked in, all smacking in the same direction, and that, with that kind of thickness of tone that they have on these last couple of records, is very much the kind of bare bones, like, bread and butter element of this record.
I was going to say that on the production thing, like, it just sounds like Slipknot at this point. I think they just know what they need to sound like, and you're like there is probably some slightly different production things here and there, and I think you can tell it more on the electronic side, which they get onto. That's where I think you can feel the most differences in the production, is that they're playing with electronics so much more in different ways. But just the core sound of when they lock into those grooves, into those riffs, the last minute of Chapeltown Rag, where it just crushes, like, just sounds so satisfying, and it's just great to hear a massive band who can still just sound that, like, hefty and, like, hungry and heavy for it, like that, heavy and like hungry for it.
Well, one of the things that we'll get to, one of the things I actually prefer about this album over We Are Not Your Kind was the production, because I A-B'd them, and We Are Not Your Kind, for me, I mean, the songwriting is, excellent pretty much throughout that entire album, but there is something about it where I don't know if it's just not got enough bass, but it doesn't have enough muscle for me in the actual.
For me, that was an improvement on that album from the Grey Chapter. So maybe this is
I agree.
Sort of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. To me, it's a decreasing issue, and to the point where now I have really no problems with the production now. But to me, it sounds much more muscular. And the Chapeltown Rag, I think releasing it early might have been a mistake, because there's slight changes between the original version and the version we have here. There's lead lines over the just before that initial breakdown, before the breakdown again at the end, which just adds so much more colour to it, and the textures that Sid and Craig are playing with, they feel so much more well realised. My main problem with this song when it first came out was that it didn't really feel finished. It felt like a bunch of great ideas that didn't hang together perfectly, but now with those slight changes, it does feel like a much more complete it feels like a much more complete song, and therefore a more worthy contribution to the album.
No, yeah, I hadn't compared the two versions, but you may be right there. I think, I guess what we're saying with these two songs, that the fact that we all are well in on both the Dying Song and the Chapeltown Rag now, and those were the big, like, obvious singles on it. This album is a lot less We Are Not Your Kind style, full of fucking that should have been a single and that should have been a single. And, you know, like we said, those two less beloved Slipknot albums before live and die on, like, a multitude of having those moments of that song's going to be there forever. This is more of a kind of album experience, and going from this point on into the track list is very interesting, I guess, the places that you have to become kind of accustomed to. Hive Mind is a real, like, so dirty, that song. Like, there's a real fucking slamming one-note riff there, but it's being torn apart by, like, unrelenting, unexpected blast beats, where you can feel that kind of, like, modern groove metal meets old-school death metal fusion that Slipknot pioneered. It's got a fucker of a riff as well, with kind of just clown absolutely, like, keg smacking from it. I think this album doesn't feel so much like a riff album in the same way, like, holy shit, Psychosocial or whatever, and it's more, they do kind of recognizable classic Slipknot style riffs that serve the purpose of getting you to kind of these more interesting things, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I think, like, Hive Mind beginning with that really weird synth sort of sound, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be like another really weird trick, and then it comes into that, like, just slamming riff. It's kind of like cool that they can pull these riffs out of these weird kind of beginnings, and they do that a lot in the album. A lot of songs aren't just gonna be like, well, this is like the weird ambient one, and this is the heavy one. They'll kind of morph the songs throughout as they go, which makes it much more interesting to me, rather than just like this is the slow one, this is the fast one, this is the electronic one. Like, it's just way more ambitious in their craft, and, like, actually trying to experiment with song structures and be more interesting.
Yeah, and I think when another kind of contrast, I guess, between this and We're Not Your Kind is when I got that album, listening to the album tracks, being a old school fucking Slipknot Iowa style Slipknot fan, I was so immediately drawn to, like, Red Flag and Orphan as, like, tracks on that record. Yeah. This album, like, I like basically all the songs on it, but it's those style songs are maybe the ones that have jumped out the least to me. And I think they're good. Like, Warranty is like a kind of almost like feels a bit of like an echo of All Hope Is Gone's title track. That kind of just, like, barbaric, like, screeching oh shit kind of feeling, but not quite as relentless as that one was. H377 is the we're gonna do some Cannibal Corpse trick songs with kind of the hammer-ons and stuff, which are, again, nowhere near the kind of hooks or chaos of, like, Orphan with that Last Time Out. And what I mean about how these kind of heavier songs get you to somewhere cool, back to Hive Mind, really strange chorus, I think, and there's something a little kind of horror about it, in, like, kind of the wailing, like, ghostly way that Corey seems to use his voice, like, till you die. Like, it gives you a melody like you were kind of expecting to at that point, but it's not quite just an obvious fucking festival sing-along. It's more sort of unsettling in that.
I think there's loads of that on Corey's melodies on this record. I think Yen has another one where his melodies are weird and unsettling, and it's like, considering, like, the lazy comment whenever Corey Taylor is singing on the Slipknot record is like, oh, it sounds like Stone Sour. Like, there's none of that here. Like, he's singing loads on this record, but it's way more interesting. It's totally, like, unique and new melodies for him.
Well, to me, Yen, a lot of the criticism you heard about it when it came out was, oh, it's Stone Sour, look what he's done, it sounds like Stone Sour.
I just don't get that, right?
I didn't see any of those criticisms with Yen, and that'd be fucking mental if anyone was saying that.
Well, this was the thing.
Or he's just trotted out every time he sings, like.
Well, this is it, and to me, Yen is a case study in what the differences are, because when you listen to Yen, he's not doing the whole, like, rock star histrionics we get used to in Stone Sour, and he's not giving it the whole, like, attitude, sunglasses, biker thing that he's been doing with that band, or was doing with that band. On this, he's morphing into a character. He's got that creeping, sort of wilting tone to his vocal, and in the chorus, it's much more harsh and urgent than anything that I've heard in a Stone Sour song.
That's what I always said about Kill Pop on the Grey chapter, when people went, oh, that one's Stone Sour because it's a bit softer. And it's like, have you listened to the song? He's a fucking serial killer on it. And that's when people were using that. And this is in the same line of, I love a brooding Slipknot single from Kill Pop back to Vermilion. And I think Yen was the single of, like, these darker songs that naturally makes it kind of almost like the flagship one for the whole branch of them. And there are a lot more songs, really, that take after Yen on this than any of the others, and that is a very good one. The kind of reverby guitars and subtle pianos and stuff. It feels very immersive, and I agree. Corey on that song is so good when he moves into that like lower register and then lifts it up with that "I die for you," fucking marrying those things. It's really, really great. But there's a lot more songs in that sort of zone through to Desard near the end. Again, Corey on those verses it injects a real great intensity to it with the kind of the echoing again part, which is again has that kind of that real manic side of him in there, even on a slower song. I think past how the album opens, "Medicine for the Dead" is maybe like the kind of the head turner on it, because I mean that Halloween synth it has, like what a weird effect.
I love the electronic sound on this album, and how like again just how spooky it is, like, but it just it's totally different and fresh on a Slipknot record. I mean it just means that Slipknot aren't stagnating because they are actually taking these punts.
When that sort of Twilight Zone synth is converted into that fat dissonant riff, it almost sounds like something Opeth might have done in like the mid 2000s. It's just that sort of off time swing with those
weird prog sound,
pretty but dissonant chords. Exactly. And this is another great example of Corey being at his best on this album. The way that pre-chorus, he just sounds completely unhinged, totally ravenous, and then when it goes into the clean chorus, somehow it doesn't lose any intensity or feel like a sellout move or a Stone Sour song. It's a completely it's a unique, playful melody that really plays off well against the other stuff he's doing throughout the track.
Yeah, the way that the intro there sort of comes back to provide like the kind of like ghostly, uncanny foundation for the chorus is really well done. And I think there, which is where we were talking about Jay earlier, the like heavy bass and like tom combinations and stuff you get going in sort of a really sparser track like that make it feel really dark and sinister, and that is quite unmistakable really as Slipknot, even though there are tones in that song that are quite fresh, and it's that the meeting point of those familiar but with some new textures going on is I think what is intriguing about this. I agree very much with what you were saying earlier in terms of there's very keen attention to sequencing on this album. Like there's a lot of moments where something feels like it pays off or takes a turn based on what came before it, and Medicine for the Dead being blown the fuck up by that massive lumbering riff of Acidic right afterwards is a great example of that. And that song feels like, again, sort of melancholic and dark and heavy in a way that's different to just like a crunching circle pit metal riff, which you've got elsewhere on the album. It's like a Slipknot like sludge song or something.
It's Slipknot getting bluesy almost, like some of the melodies, and like I think on like Corey's delivery, it's almost like in a way probably the most like radio sound on the record, but it's again not done in a way that's like dull and like bland. It's really interesting in the way they do it, where like the melodies are probably like the most commercial sounding, but it's not flat and wet.
Yeah, I don't think that about the commercial thing, because I think it's the way you've got Corey like properly singing a solo out on it, and you've got like rock lead guitar parts and stuff.
I mean that's what I say, because it's just what I associate with like US radio rock.
Sure, but the way you've got those things being like churned up and bended in this kind of sickening heavy way by like the sludge of it, it's like that kind of Nola like fuck up mix of those elements and stuff. And there I was again going like, thank fuck we have a band like as massive, properly massive as Slipknot, who are going to do songs as like tormented and doomed and evil as Acidic, that this many people will hear. I was just like, yes.
Yeah, but that's it. It's like in the melodies, but because of everything else that's going on around it, it stops it from being really commercial. And again, like when the solo comes in on that song, which is like proper epic Guitar Hero solo on it, but there's so much else going on around that solo as well, and it comes just background, and that thudding drum beat comes in afterwards. Like this is just like one of those like real like fuck yeah moments that this is how good Slipknot can sound when they are like firing on all cylinders.
Well, I wonder if the title is a nod to this, but this really reminded me of Acid Bath in parts.
Yeah, I thought that as well. Yeah.
Slightly, not, you don't want to say again, not commercial, but a slightly more, what's the word? A slightly more erudite, maybe it might be the wrong word again, but like there's something more melodic than just pure sludge and pure nihilism. There's something, a hint of songwriter flair, I guess you might call it.
Like
I don't know.
Grunge stuff almost.
Yeah,
like.
Yeah. Sorry, that's
this is exactly what I was trying to get at. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like, it's that combined with a bit of maybe Stone Temple Pilots. There's a bit of Scott Weiland in his vocal melodies, and it's a combination that maybe in your head you think that sounds like a bit of a mess, but Slipknot on current form are able to meld both of those influences with their sound in a way that feels completely inventive and completely appropriate.
Yeah, and all across it, you've got Sid and Craig being used in quite subtle ways. There's no like mad DJ scratch part of this record. It's more the sort of strange distortion and stuff like that, and layering percussion and all that. I mean, even Warranty has a fucking like church choir bridge before like the kind of breakdown part. And Finale is beautiful to close as well.
Yeah.
Like the kind of really like romantic like plucking strings and orchestration and stuff, and the choirs that come in there that like swirl around in your ears like you're entering the underworld around a winner of a melancholic Corey Taylor refrain again. Every time I finish the album, that's kind of the last hook I hear. It carries it with me for a while. So good. And Corey Taylor, I think we've said it a lot, but he gets to do more on this album in the way of kind of the more despondent, dramatic style stuff than either the kind of like rabid dog foaming at the mouth Slipknot or just skyscraper commercial chorus Slipknot.
Yeah, and to be honest, I was very relieved that this final track was so different from Solway Firth, because as much as I love that song, I was hoping that this album would see them end in a different way, particularly if this whole thing of the end so far, you wanted maybe something a bit more dramatic and maybe something even a bit smaller, and that's exactly what they've delivered here. I say smaller because it starts so small, but by the end, as you say, with the choirs and the riffs and the backing vocals and that sort of thing, it's a real great example of how good they are as songwriters.
Yeah.
Because taking it from that very small acorn, and you immediately go, oh, that's already in my head. And by the end, it's just this lavish, loud, bombastic finale.
Finale. You want to see Slipknot play with the 9 members on stage and also like a 10-piece orchestra and fucking choir.
Exactly.
Like, you want to see 30, 40 people on stage doing that song.
It's how they take such a miserable melody for it and just make it sound so huge on that chorus, and that hook in has just been stuck in my ear because it's such a just like idiosyncratic melody, I guess, that like doesn't sound like the timing of the words, or it sounds almost slightly off, but it just adds to the kind of like dreariness of the record while still making it sound so grand. And I think that's like, there is a sense of grandeur on this record that I think is a real like step up where Slipknot have like maybe been on like, the last couple of records which haven't been as like imposing almost in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with We Are Not Your Kind, they were treading in some of the things with stuff like Spiders and all of that.
Yeah.
And these kind of more out there ideas, and this is them very much following up of that. And I think, again, if you look at how many of the album tracks take after Yen of the singles, you've got, Adderall, Medicine, Acidic, Desada, Finale. Fast songs, you've only really got like, Hive Mind, Warranty, Heirloom, H3777, which, like we said, are kind of most interesting when they take a turn into something kind of moodier. It feels overall like a kind of melancholic, spiraling kind of album. And I think the obvious drawback is that this is the worst Slipknot album for bangers. Like, even like All Hope Is Gone and The Grey Chapter, the staple songs from those massively dwarf this. Like Psychosocial, Sulfur, Dead Memories, through to Custer, The Negative One, Sarcastrophe, whatever. Like, this doesn't have those like clear, immediate Slipknot classic songs. It doesn't, and it is the least providing of those that they've ever done. But as much as anything they've ever done, it's a really immersive listen.
Yeah, totally. I think it's the sign of them actually trying to be different. Was keeping enough of those, like, okay, those classic songs are there. They're not of the high standard that they are, but they are still really good at being the classic Slipknot songs. I'm not going to turn my nose up at any of those songs.
They are some of the biggest metal songs of the year. It's just
in
the Slipknot pantheon is what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, it makes up for it in every other aspect. I think I would take that trade off at this point because they've written Psychosocial. Do you know what I mean? Like they've got The Negative One. They've got All Out Life. They got the whole catalogue of them. And I think that is absolutely the case here. But I would, at this point in their career, I'd take that. I want more interesting experimental ideas from Slipknot at this point because they've got the best catalogue of metal bangers anyone can have. Like, simple as that, really, isn't it?
One thing that I thought at the end of We Are Not Your Kind was that the straight ahead, pure aggression, pedal to the metal songs, again, like Red Flag, Orphan, that sort of thing, those to me, they weren't necessarily the weakest moments, but they might be the least remarkable in the sense that you come to the, for me at least, you get to the end of the album and you think, well, am I going to listen to Red Flag or am I going to listen to Disaster Piece, that sort of thing. So I kind of wrote off Slipknot writing songs of that standard again. And I know we've agreed that the most interesting stuff on this album is the more experimental things, the things that have stayed with us are, the bizarre flights of fancy. But I don't want to, just gloss over. Hive Mind, for me in particular, was just, it completely floored me. Just each change of pace, just, completely unpredictable. Corey sounds more just enraged than he has done maybe since Volume 3, in my opinion. Or Hell, or H377, whatever people are calling it, Warranty. Those songs...
Oh, that's what that spells. I didn't know what the fuck that was. No idea. I was like, is this like a chemical? Who knows?
Well, each of those songs, those are the three that really stand out to me. This is, again, on this one, despite being their most experimental and maybe overall their most sort of downtrodden, lumbering Patience album, when it flies off the handle, it's as savage as anything they've done since The Glory Is. And I think that, combined with the more muscular production that I was talking about earlier, really, brings it up to standard. And particularly Hive Mind and Hell were definite album highlights for me.
Hive Mind is, of like the heavier songs, probably my favourite because it's still got the more interesting ideas wrapped up in it as well. So I think like it's like a really good middle ground.
Yeah, Hive Mind is really good. See, I did listen to particularly Red Flag and Orphan on that album so fucking much, and I wonder how it's like riffing and everything. But for me, like again, when this album does go, like it is really, really good. It's just I think We Are Not Your Kind feels like it went into a lot of different areas and absolutely just fucking nailed like everyone could be a kind of standard thing. This feels more like the kind of retreating into the kind of sort of underbelly feel. And I guess the thing I'm reminded of there is almost like the relationship between the last two Biffy Clyro albums, where they did a celebration of endings, which was like the most blockbuster, like stars sparkling in your eyes Biffy Clyro album in years, and then they did this kind of weird, unconventional, slightly awkward part 2 that I think most people would like less than its predecessor in pure like song wow factor. But we all seem to agree it's quite an encouraging, admirable, rewarding thing to follow in the wake of that record in terms of the ongoing vitality of the band, and that's what I kind of think of The End so far.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. I think like this to me feels way more rewarding and feels more like this. If this is where Slipknot are going to be going, it's really promising that a band in their position are not going to be, like I say, resting on us, because Slipknot could at this point, and I wouldn't complain. I'd take Slipknot just chucking out every couple of years a collection of like, these are good metal bangers, but the fact that they could easily be like just doing that, but they're like, no, we want to creatively push ourselves. It's really encouraging.
Yeah. What do you think? Don't just say Adderall is poo-poo because it doesn't sound like the Heretic anthem. There is your review to cap off this mad month